It's Mark Schultz. He is. You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you, the Thursday edition of 2020. And a conversation shortly I'll invite you to join into. It's going to be one of those. You might like to lean in just a little closer to the radio. Don't miss a word. And we'll try and build on what we're talking about. A complicated topic, I guess. If you start to talk history, if you start to talk philosophy, some of those things can be a little daunting. So we'll take our time and we'll talk through some things. No listener left behind in a conversation like this today. We're back to make sense of what we keep hearing, the word woke. Some say wokery, others say wokeism. And while the woke person wears the label proudly, taking positions in politics and culture on a range of social justice issues, the Christian typically ought to see something a little deeper in there. Wokeism has become like an alternative religion with permission to question everything. It's become the catch cry of movements like Black Lives Matter, or there's this thing called critical race theory that divides minorities into victims and perpetrators. And there are all sorts of social justice activists. Well, wokeism has grown into a combative opponent of Christianity, attacking those things that Christians hold to, founded in biblical truth. We talk about these things often. Well, a new book explores this ever-increasing woke world we live in. It's called Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. Its various authors offer insights into the woke revolution sweeping Western nations, including Australia. It's edited by legal academics Professor Augusto Zimmermann and Joshua Forrester. Some insights today from legal philosopher Professor Augusto Zimmermann, head of law at Sheridan Institute of Higher Education in Perth. He's also adjunct professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, Sydney campus. He's the founder and president of the Western Australian Legal Theory Association and a former Law Reform Commissioner in WA. Augusto Zimmermann, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Augusto, I don't want to leave listeners behind. As you'll know, when you start to talk about deep things, philosophy, history, those things can be, for some people, daunting. So let's start perhaps just with the title of your book, which has got a little bit of an academic feel to it. It's got an historic feel to it. Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. Let's break down some of this for a moment, because that word Wokeshevism seems to me to have some similarity to Bolshevism, which some will recognize as the way you describe those elements of the Russian Revolution. Is that where that connection comes for Wokeshevism?
Yes, that's right. It's very difficult to find a proper definition to this sort of movement that's now so pervasive in the West. It could be a mixture, considered to be a mixture of postmodern theology or philosophy with post-colonialism and many other characteristics. So the word woke or the term refers to this particular movement that has a very anti-liberal, a very radical approach. And that's why we have associated the woke movement with another movement that was responsible for a revolution in the early 20th century, which is the Bolshevik Revolution. And that led to the creation, as I can say, of this title for the book, which is called Wokeshevism. Here is the book. And it's an academic contribution of leading authors from all over the world. And these academics decided to express their opinions on what the woke movement actually encompasses, and the connections of this movement with other extremist movements that are not really associated with a proper rational discussion on different subjects, but it is more about imposing a particular worldview regarding social justice or matters of racial justice.
So you've got Wokeshevism and a connection there to some of the developments that happened in the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and some listeners might like to, do a little bit of research on that because there were some elements to that movement that we might even touch on some further. The other part of the title of your book, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. When you say critical theories, what does that mean?
Well, look, it's important to consider that there are roots, original roots for the woke movement to be found in the past. And one of the roots, I would say, is associated with a movement in the 1970s in the United States of America called critical legal studies. I have written a book in the past called Western Legal Theory, where this particular movement is dissected. But the interesting thing about the critical legal studies movement in the 70s is that it was led by extremists from very prestigious universities such as Harvard Law School and Yale. And these academics, they have a very radical approach to law, obviously, and they connected law with politics in particular. And they thought that the judge should assist them in the advancement of their radical ideology, even thinking that the rule of law and the idea of equality before the law was no longer productive or beneficial. And then, as derived of this particular movement, you have now some of its variations, such as radical feminist jurisprudence and critical race theory. And what this book does is to allow, if I would say, leading academics to have a proper opinion on the subject. One of the contributors, for instance, is, if not the leading, one of the leading law professors in the United States, Professor Robert George, which I must say has given a good contribution, an important one, connecting the woke movement with the need to rescue our natural law foundations. I think the best way to fight a bad idea is to actually develop a better one. And the book is not only criticizing or even deconstructing critical theories in general, but it is also proposing a solution for the problem in some of the articles that are contained in this volume.
When those critical theories come into clash with those natural laws, as you say, and oftentimes, and we've had this sort of conversation before about how natural law is something that is grounded in, we'd call it a biblical law. But when you've got the concepts then of freedom, because we would say that there are some things that make a civilization free, but there's these challenging thoughts that come that say that people need to be liberated from the things that enslave them. Any thoughts here around how this sort of critical theory interacts with the way that we as Christians might think as a good, sound, natural law that would help people live harmoniously?
Yes, look, critical theories in general, they embrace a Marxist approach. And Karl Marx believed that there is no objective standard of morality and ultimately of legality and justice. It was all based on the idea that these values are derived from the social context. Originally, what we had in Marxism is the denial of objective standards for human rights on the basis that these are impositions of the ruling classes. He even went to the point of claiming that what we in Christianity have considered to be inalienable rights, they're actually not so inalienable, but according to Marxist ideology, they are social constructs, and they can be, as a result, set aside or perhaps ignored by the authorities. We have to make sure that this sort of ideology doesn't become persuasive or influential in the West, as they have unfortunately now become, I must say. But that really leads to the understanding or the perspective that the authorities or the government, to be more specific, can undermine any right of the individual whatsoever, because they are no longer considered to be created by God, but basically uh, developed by the state. And what the state gives, of course, then you can imagine that it can also take away. And that's the main problem with Marxist ideology and this woke movement, that they can divide people into categories. And these categories will receive more rights, or they can receive less rights, but they are placed in a position of antagonism, so that you're going to have a group, in order to um, think that they can have more rights, oppressing and undermining the rights of the other competing groups. It's really a tribalistic approach, whereby people are placed against each other on the grounds of religion, race, and gender, and so forth.
We'll continue our conversation in just a few moments. I do want to give the opportunity for listeners today. You might want to interact with our special guest, Professor Augusto Zimmermann. You might have a question, a comment, you might even have a critique. Well, 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. We'll continue in just a few moments. Good to have you with us, and the talkback line open on 1-800-316-316. You might have a question about wokeism. And our special guest today, Professor Augusto Zimmermann, he and Joshua Forrester, a couple of legal academics, are editors of a new book. The book is called Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left, and an important book that speaks into a little more depth than you might appreciate when you're looking at any sort of interview around the topic of wokeism. Because, Augusto, you've called on a whole lot of people who are quite highly reputable in these sorts of issues. But let me just ask you about your contribution, and then I'll ask you about some of the contributions that others have made. What was your contribution to the book?
Well, it's a contribution associating Karl Marx with some of the most despicable acts of tyranny in the 20th century. So it's the influence of Karl Marx, for instance, on the Nazi ideology, and the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis acknowledged this influence. We have available to us statements of Adolf Hitler acknowledging that the Marxist contribution was important to develop some of the most important aspects of National Socialist ideology. We can never forget that National Socialism is a socialist ideology, and that Marxism has prepared the ideological mindset for state. I describe it as state-sanctioned extermination of people on a massive scale. I try to explain the quite obvious connections or similarities between Marxist class warfare that destroys people on the basis of social class or because of social class, and the Nazi race-inspired destruction of people because of their ethnicity. So my advice to those extremists from the left that has destroyed the statutes of the likes of Abraham Lincoln and even others elements from the past who fought against racism, I think they should actually target the statutes of Karl Marx, because he was a highly racist person who had terrible things to say about the Jews and even about the black people. So why not to actually have to think about the commitment to Marxist ideology and stop praising a man who was such a despicable human being and so much racist and a bigot. So I make a suggestion for them. If they want to destroy images, they should start with the images of Karl Marx, their idol.
Okay, and listeners might want to extend some of those thoughts a little further with a question, but let me just give this level what I think might be clarity, and that is the connection between a line, Karl Marx to Adolf Hitler to National Socialism and the thought of race warfare. That might make us a little bit concerned about some of the issues around race debates that happen in the West and even here in Australia. Are you suggesting that that would be the sort of way you could actually link Marx through Hitler to nationalist socialism to some of the things that we might be even talking about in a race debate here today, even in Australia?
Of course, every time an ideology selects a group of people to be demonized, then you are inviting the state to start exterminating or eliminating these particular individuals. And what I try to say is that concentration camps, for instance, didn't start with the Nazis. They were implemented in modern Europe by communistic regimes. And we started, for instance, with the gulags in the Soviet Union. And all these terrible consequences of Marxist ideology leading to some of the most dreadful aspects of international socialist ideology, which is also the same as communism, is another name for this particular ideology. That gets from it a Marxist inspiration, because Marx exterminated or induced to the extermination of people by claiming that entire categories of individuals should be considered to be enemies of the state. And when it happens, and this demonization of people happens, then you must have to exorcise them. In Christianity, our main enemy is not a human being. We don't fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and potentialities in the air. So Christians have as the main enemy a spiritual being. But when it comes to materialistic ideologies, the enemy to be destroyed is no longer operating in the spiritual realm. These are actually human beings that must be separated and targeted for destruction in order that the state can create the new man or the new society. You see the danger with this sort of approach, and in the history we know that it leads to absolutely tragic and even genocidal consequences.
We're taking calls, 1-800 316 316. Let's squeeze a couple in before news. Alex is in Melbourne. Hi, Alex. Welcome along.
Thank you. Yes, I'm coming from the Bible. It says the law was whoever lives by whoever does the law will live by the law, and that the law is not according to faith. So it's for everyone. It's for everyone, but when politics starts to influence law, well, that's where the problems come in. That's already because the law is for everyone and for everyone to be treated equally. But politics is, of course, what we're seeing happening now.
Alex, good thought. Augusto, a thought for Alex?
Yes, and that's the main problem. One of the main problems. You know that being a legal theorist, I have investigated this problem of the contamination of the legal system by politics and radical ideologies, and that's where we have a problem with the critical legal studies movement in the United States in the 1970s, when they connected the law with the idea of politics and even incited the unelected judicial elite to take sides in the political realm. And so critical legal theorists, they believe that law being all about politics makes judges having to take sides, and they will take the side of those who they regard to be in a position, socially speaking, of disadvantage. So rather than believing in the concept of equality before the law, that everybody is endowed with inalienable rights and they are equal, these people believe that law is an instrument of oppression, and it's the imposition of a group of its will over another. Can you imagine the damage that this can be caused if judges embrace this approach? They're no longer impartial adjudicators of the law, but they are stimulated and even incited by this bunch of radicals, extremists, to take positions and to not use the law in a fair and equitable manner, but to impose the will of a particular group over another.
Alex in Melbourne, thank you so much for your contribution. 1800 316 316 to join in our conversation today. Let's squeeze in another one. Jason in Sydney. Hi, Jason. Welcome.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. I think
Good
one
morning.
thing that hasn't been, good morning, one thing I think hasn't been discussed at the moment, two brief things really, is one, is wokeism, what we would call it now, and political correctness, like a little bit further down the track. It started off with some well-meaning ideas about anti-discrimination, about fighting racism. Because I remember the 70s and 80s, and I'm a musician, and I remember some popular music artists doing fundraisers and doing special concerts. But a group of these people, especially from England and Europe, they had a love affair with the USSR. So I thought, I was confused as a young fella because I thought, they're saying nice things about fighting racism, equality for the poor, but at the same time, I saw, and then I learned more later on during the 80s, and of course the floodgates opened in the 90s, about what the USSR was actually doing to its own people. But in the West, we were being told that it was all about looking after people. And so, I mean, in other words, I've heard in the past that if you want to make rat poison, you have to sprinkle in a bit of nice food as well for the rat.
Jason,
So
I'm going to have to cut in here because it's news time, and we're going to hold a thought there, and we'll come back after news and we'll talk about that, because what you're talking about here is popular culture, propagating these sorts of ideals. We're going to return after Vision National News with our special guest, Professor Augusto Zimmermann. We're talking about a new book that he and Joshua Forrester edited with some great contributions from people around the world. It's called Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. We're back with more after news. If you are just joining us, joining into a very much deeper conversation around what's changing our culture at this present time and perhaps some of the dangers associated with that, we're talking about a new book called Wokeshevism and looking at making sense of that word woke. Some say wokery, others wokeism. And while a woke person wears that label proudly, taking positions in politics and culture on a range of social justice issues, the Christian needs to see something a little deeper in that word woke. Wokeism has become almost like an alternative religion, with permission to question everything. Well, a new book explores this ever-increasing woke world we live in. It's called Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. Its various authors offer insights into the woke revolution sweeping Western nations, including Australia. It's edited by legal academics Professor Augusto Zimmermann and Joshua Forrester. Well, our special guest is legal philosopher Professor Augusto Zimmermann. He's head of law at Sheridan Institute of Higher Education in Perth. He's also adjunct professor of law at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, Sydney campus. He's a founder and president of the Western Australian Legal Theory Association and a former Law Reform Commissioner in Western Australia. The book launch for the book, as I say, it's a new book, brand new. The launch is coming up on Monday night at the RSL Club in Belmont in Perth, WA, 6:30 p.m. You can register to be at that event at the Walter website. That's the West Australian Legal Theory website, walta.net.au. You can register there, as I understand it. Hey, Augusto, did you say you've even got a few bit of free food and drinks on, and it'll become, I guess, is going to, the party part of it all becomes a seminar on Wokeshevism. Is that the way it's planned?
Yeah, that's right. It is more than just a book launch. There will be signed copies of the book available for those who wish to acquire a copy. But they will have also the opportunity to interact with great people who will be attending, and to enjoy a nice meal as well. The event is a seminar and a book launch. So Joshua and I will have a couple of important things to say during this event.
Now, let's come back to what we began to talk about just before the news. And thanks so much to Jason in Sydney, who called in and raised a very important point about how woke culture is disseminated or permeates through a national culture. And he was suggesting things like music and I guess around issues like popular culture. The way that those can be used as propaganda tools by people who have a different ideology. Any thoughts here for Jason and the thoughts that he was contributing?
Well, these sort of movements and ideologies, they are counterfeit religions. These people act in a way that's not necessarily based on proper argument, but it's based on faith and a commitment to a certain cause. And of course, if they believe that this is ultimately the final goal and end, the means can be justifiable. And that's why these sort of characters can commit crimes and do things that are considered to be reprehensible from a moral point of view. But they believe that even immorality and despicable behavior can actually be ultimately justified because it is for the advancement of or the evolution of a particular destiny for humanity. And intellectuals and this sort of people, they love communistic ideology because that can give them a sense of empowerment. Once you abandon God, you become a God to yourself. And the communist ideology tempts people to embrace them because they find that they can have influence, a level of influence via governmental action that they would never have in a free society where people can be able to make their own decisions and be accountable to God. So people who try to play God and abandon God, they are naturally inclined to believe that the state or any other entity can be a replacement to God and his higher laws. I think that's the main reason as to why communistic ideology tends to be so influential in intellectual circles, because it gives them a sense of empowerment and importance that they would not have if we were able to be free individuals.
Interesting to say when the state becomes godlike, because the ultimate example of that, of course, is North Korea. And some will say China has moved into that, where the state becomes like God to the people. But coming back to what Jason was saying, though, because the Russians, he was saying there was a fascination with the Russians back in the 1970s. I think some people still have a fascination with the Russians today. Today, the Russians are a communist dictatorship too. Any thoughts here, just to bring this into the present, not just a reflection on history, but people who think that communist regimes today, like being friendly to the Chinese or to the Russians, there's dangers there? How do you describe that?
I think it's a sense of desperation as well. There is this understanding that perhaps we can find something that operates in a more proper manner as to what we are presently witnessing in the West. So, of course, for us to know whether that particular regime on the other side of the world or in a different part of the world we work properly or not, I don't think we in Australia can make such assessment. But what I find it quite interesting is that people are desperate, and they just want to find a sort of a salvation or a solution. And those who do not have faith or do not have God, they are going to try to find solutions in human organizations and ideologies. And that is where the problem lies, because it is an alternative to the worship of the living God. When people start to worship government and to worship the state, this inevitably is a form of idolatry that leads to a great and tragic consequences.
Let's talk about some more of the content in your book. And one of the chapters has a contribution from James Allen. He's a legal academic, and he's from Queensland. He's written a chapter called Wokery and High Court Otherness. And I guess if you're wanting to stimulate a little bit of controversy, just be a critic of the High Court.
Yes.
What are the sorts of things and the reflections that James Allen has offered in his contribution?
I must say that James is a brilliant writer, and he told me about the difficulty to write this article because of the amount of topics to possibly be discussed in the chapter, because there's so much craziness going on. But being the Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland, Professor James Allen is also, I must say, a constitutional law professor. He decided that it would be appropriate for him to discuss how the High Court decides cases more recently. And he gave us the example of one of the worst judicial rulings ever made by a court in the world. It's called Love and the Commonwealth. If I'm not wrong, this decision is from, 2020. And it is an appalling decision whereby two criminals, actually, who committed, I think, one rape, the other, I don't know, perhaps even murder, but they were allowed to stay, being foreigners, by the way, they were allowed to stay in the country. I don't know if they even got a permanent residency as a result, because they identified themselves as Aborigines. One was born in New Zealand, the other was born in Papua New Guinea. But because they identified themselves as Aborigines and they got an unelected Aboriginal leader who basically befriended them, they were allowed to stay in the country on such grounds. And James Allen tells us about the absurdity of that particular decision, where people can identify with a certain group in Australia, and therefore they can stay living in Australia even after committing heinous crimes against women and children.
So when then you are making an assessment about a judgment like that, and I imagine, you've got to be very careful when you are a critic of the High Court judgments, but when you can see that where one of the parties comes from New Zealand, another one from Papua New Guinea, but they're identifying as Australian Aboriginal, and the High Court defends their right to do that, I imagine that's where you've got to say, well, hang on a second, is this what woke is? So is this a demonstration? How do you describe what's woke when you take something that's completely absurd almost?
It's completely absurd, but it's based on identity politics. And who are we to claim that a person is not what he or she claims to be? That's the madness of the whole situation. That's why we have children being confused by this mob. That's why people don't know anything about themselves. That's an invitation for depression and even suicide. I think this is a very sick world, the one where we live, where objective standards are no longer accepted, and we are forced to believe or accept people upholding the most bizarre ideas. And if you dare to have an objection that's rational, that's reasonable, you are accused as being intolerant. So the concept of tolerance has never been about acceptance of ideas. It was to accept that people can have different opinions. But I don't have to celebrate absurd opinions. That's not real tolerance at all. So the concept has been distorted by postmodern ideology to such an extent that I would say that those who claim to be tolerant are the most bigoted, intolerant people I have ever met in my life.
When we're talking about politicizing the judiciary, and the High Court is in question here with James Allen. There are individual people who make up that judiciary. You might hope that they will have an Australian constitutional mindset when they are delivering their deliberations here, but of course there are individuals, and individuals are affected by what's happening in the mass culture, aren't they? So even
Yes.
the people at the top who make those sorts of deliberations, they are themselves watching the media and listening to all of the propaganda that's being propagated.
Yes, you see, for instance, that Professor Anthony Gray, who is a leading free speech academic, he writes many articles, probably the most prolific legal academic in Australia. Most of his articles are published in law journals, but I would regard him as the leading voice for freedom of speech in my area of law. And what he explains is that the court sometimes, because of the postmodern approach, has not only disregarded freedom of speech, but also disregarded the real meaning of words. And there is a good example regarding the borders during the health crisis, the madness that took place in this country over the last 3 years, where a parent crisis was used to justify all sorts of oppressive measures, including separating parents from their children and violating the most basic rights of the individual. And he wrote an article in a previous volume of the Western Australian Jurist that we published on the banner of fundamental rights in the age of COVID. And he explains that the High Court took a very postmodern reading of Section 19.2 of the Constitution, saying that, or concluding that the term absolute is no longer absolute, so that Section 19.2, saying that the borders should be absolutely free, they are no longer to be taken so much as an absolutely free. The word absolute now is relative, according to the High Court. So the High Court managed to close the borders when the Constitution says the borders should never be closed because they should be absolutely free. And the court said the word absolute is no longer absolute. We can make it relative now.
Postmodern reading of the Constitution and no longer having absolutes. Is there a way back when these things, the genie is out of the bottle? Is there a way back, Augusto, to recognising that there are absolutes? The Christian says, of course there are absolutes because God is absolute and what he says has weight. What are your thoughts here for bringing back an absolute, an idea of absolutes?
Well, I think then the book gives us hope via the contribution of Professor Robert George, and he's a professor of law at Princeton University, and as I say, probably the most renowned legal academic in the United States of America. And he wrote a chapter here about natural law, addressing questions of human dignity, natural law, and human rights. And he tells us about the ideas and beliefs about God and divine will playing in the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms. He even says that that statement in the American Declaration of Independence that we are endowed by God in inalienable rights is the foundation for the existence and protection of individual rights in his country. So if we bring back this foundation, solid foundation, then we can finally have the protection of inalienable rights. And the judges will be able to uphold the natural law, uphold the rule of law, and make sure that they are not reinventing the wheel. Because if we destroy this foundation, as it is being presently done, the judges will have a power to become the ultimate arbitrators of right and wrong, or the ultimate authorities on right and wrong. And they can even create fundamental rights once the rights are no longer seen as created by God. Then the judges can invent new fundamental rights, as they did in the Obergefell case, whereby they basically decided that same-sex marriage is a fundamental right that to be fundamental has to have always existed. So when the court tells you that a right is fundamental, it's basically saying that this right is fundamental because it's essential to human nature. Then I find it quite unbelievable that this statement was made to the creation of a new institution. It's almost as saying that everybody was very stupid and nobody knew that same-sex marriage had always been a fundamental right for that group to embrace. I mean, it's basically saying that in the whole history of humanity, nobody had the capacity to realize that this has always been a right. I mean, that's the level of arrogance that we face.
Let's come back to Wokeshevism, and as you were very clearly mentioning in the first part of our conversation, there is a method of people taking up weapons against one another because it's a power struggle. There are those who are identifying as minorities, and there are those who are then considered to be perpetrators. There is a battle that's going on. There's another chapter in the book called Vilification Laws, Tools for Tyranny, Alexander Millard and John Steenhoff, that lots of our listeners might recognise that name, John Steenhoff, as the leader of the Human Rights Law Alliance and dealing with all sorts of challenges around vilification that's happening here in Australia right now. What have you got to say about that chapter, Augusto?
Well, that chapter is quite important because the authors examine the influence of critical theory on certain aspects of Australian apparently tolerance laws and so-called. They also called the vilification laws. And according to them, these laws are strongly connected to core principles of critical theory. These principles are actually, according to them, antagonistic to a healthy democracy because they forbid or prevent, to use a better word, the free exchange of ideas. So I agree with them entirely. And the argument goes, I'll see if I can summarize this, is to say that the more an idea deserves to be commented or even criticized, the more the idea is being protected. The person who upholds the idea, because we are living in a postmodern world where people can have all sorts of bizarre ideas, the person who happens to be very intolerant to a critique of his or her ideas sues others or persecutes others and suppresses the ideas of others or the opinions of others, eroding a free and robust exchange of political opinions or religious opinions or whatever. So what they say is that the more a person is intolerant, guess what? The more he or she is going to take delight in using these laws as an instrument of suppression of rational, reasonable debate. These people actually are the real bigots, and they are using laws that as instrument of bigotry and intolerance. And John Steenhoff talks about how critical theory paves the way to these sort of things because it divides people into groups, and these groups hate each other. It's the ancient Roman strategy of divide and conquer, turning people against each other, and it's creating, undoubtedly, as a result, a more divisive and unhealthy society. And their contribution in this book is essential because they say that these laws are suppressing debate and eroding democracy in Australia. I don't think we have a real democracy in Australia. I don't feel free in this nation anymore.
Well, I know there'll be some who will want to get a hold of this new book because they'll appreciate some of the sentiments you're expressing, Augusto. And let me just say the book is called Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left, Perhaps it's not your ordinary novel light reading, but you might want to get a hold of that. There is a special book launch that's coming up on Monday. That's this coming Monday, the 27th of March, at the RSL Club in Belmont in Perth, WA. It starts at 6:30pm. You can go to the walter.net.au website, the West Australian Legal Theory Association website, walta.net.au to register. And Augusto did say there's some free food and drinks, and it's likely to develop into a seminar on Wokeshevism. We did have a call from one listener, Roy, who says he can't attend the conference, but he wants to buy a signed copy of Augusto's book, and I'll put you in touch with him afterwards, Augusto. So walter.net.au, the book is Wokeshevism, Critical Theories and the Tyrant Left. I imagine people can get a hold of that from the Walter website, but also no doubt available online. If you were to Google that, that'll be available from online booksellers as well. Always good getting your insights. Congratulations on another book. You seem to come out with books very frequently these days, Augusto. Look forward to talking about your next one coming out sometime soon too. Hey, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with our listeners today on 2020.
Well, it is a great pleasure. God bless you and God bless your listeners.